Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of the Ummah Times. And we'd like to welcome back Brother David Livingstone, the esteemed scholar and investigator for over 30 years in the area of the occult influence in history. He is author of several books, including The Dying God, The Hidden History of Western Civilization, Terrorism and the Illuminati, A 3,000-Year History, and Black Terror, White Soldiers, Islam, Fascism, and the New Age, and Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea. Assalamu alaikum, Brother David, and how are you doing?
Alhamdulillah.
That's great. Well, we'd like to welcome you on the show and have this kind of, we would like you to kind of share your findings on the great research you've done on the origins of basically dark forces that have been plaguing this planet. And this time, we'd like to really hear your, I guess, findings in connection to that short episode in the Quran where Allah talks about the episode where Harut and Marut came down and its connection with how people learn black magic. And it's very interesting. There's no consensus. I was just looking at some of the classical summaries of this. There is no consensus on this whole episode. There's different takes. Yeah. So I would love to hear your findings in connection to this and to, I guess, the later deviations that have taken place on this planet. So yeah, so I'll let you take it away, Brother David.
Great. Okay. To start with, I'd like to explain that all this research started out because I was trying to understand the world that we live in. So obviously a lot of decisions. There's the way that the political decisions are publicized, the way we hear about them in the media, and then there's what really happens behind the scenes. Some of that you can find from, some talented journalists who will expose things that are happening. Sometimes to get a little deeper, you can find some more information by academics who've studied, specifics in certain areas, and then you get into the areas that are really murky. Sometimes, in some cases, dismissed as conspiracy theory by the media. Sometimes, often the case, a lot of this material is covered by researchers who are non-professional. Sometimes their methods are not that sound, and it starts to get difficult to identify the truth and who's really responsible and how. So knowing that, that's what really set me out to try to get as deep as I could, to try to get as close as possible to the truth, but to try to stick to the evidence, to try to support any of the findings with as much evidence as possible. And so interestingly, this is where the Quran really comes in. So, there's a tendency I find in recent decades for Muslims to basically separate what they consider is specifically relevant to Islam and then other areas which they sort of marginalize. And there's a tendency, particularly with politics and certain aspects and areas of study of politics, that are not considered relevant to the affairs of Muslims. So one thing, so I just finished my latest book, which is called Ordo Abkal, is actually 6 volumes. So it goes into quite a breadth of history. It goes back to the beginning, like my first book, The Dying God, but covers a whole nother range of ideas that I didn't even know existed. And the challenge is that a lot of these things, this is really getting to a depth of history in so many areas that Muslims have never heard of. And they can't, for the most part, I imagine they couldn't even consider how these topics could be relevant. So the thing is, because I think a large part of the problem, the politics that we live in as an ummah these days is largely a result of colonized minds. And I think, what's happening is that, most of the modern Islamic states need to try to protect themselves from criticism. So they create this dichotomy between what is considered Islam and what is considered politics. And politics is basically, for the most part, been treated as a marginal subject. That what's more important, of course, is individual practice of prayer and fasting and belief and things like that. When really in Islam there should never be a distinction. That the two are always intertwined. That we purify ourselves in order that we can be better, more, make a more impactful contribution in the world that we live in. So there's never a distinction. So these topics, while they might seem new or fringe, and even though they're very, very remote from the direct affairs of Muslims today, they are still part of the larger picture. They are still fundamental to understanding the message of the Quran, I believe, and our obligation towards Allah in any time. So as I study these topics and as I trace them, so one of the most important topics, of course, is Freemasonry. So to try to understand, studying Freemasonry is difficult because, in fact, for all these topics, really in the last 30 years, there's been an explosion in academic studies. So it's changed a lot. There's a lot of, well-founded, well-researched academic studies, and a lot of these topics that we can much better understand what has happened. But still, there's not that much material. And so if you look to the literature of the Freemasons themselves, it's full of all kinds of fantasies. It's based in truth, but it's usually embellished to quite an extent. So it's difficult to understand if you're looking at just Masonic literature to try to understand what really happened. And because, for Masonic histories, they go back very far into ancient times, right? It doesn't go back just to the Crusades, but it goes back far beyond that to Pythagoras and Plato, Euclid in particular. And so when you go back into those topics, you can see that there was some degree of truth to what they were saying, but of course, it's mostly fantasy designed to create the sort of modern legend of what the craft is all about. And so the reality is that there's what scholars today have begun to refer to as the Western esoteric tradition, right? So there's this whole history of occultism, which has impacted many civilizations, not only the West, but also Islam, of course. And there's a particular group or set of ideas that you can trace back to ancient times. There's different elements to them. Scholars tend not to see them as one. They tend to see them as sort of, elements that are related to each other. For my studies, it's basically typically one tradition that has many sort of outward aspects. And so you can trace these ideas all the way back to very ancient times, to at least Babylon in the 6th century BC, and often far beyond that. And what you see is there's a particular set of ideas. There is what's called Neoplatonism, which comes from Plato. There's alchemy, which is closely related to a cult called Hermeticism, which was born in Egypt in Christian times. There's what's called the ancient mysteries. So these were cults that were practiced, throughout the ancient Middle East. What's important is that when the Quran says that the Christians imitated the practices of the people before them when they adopted the idea of the Son of God and the Trinity, you can trace those ideas specifically to the ancient mysteries. So all these topics, as remote as they seem, they're really crucial to understanding, our religion and the world we live in. And there's Hermeticism, and there's alchemy, and there's astrology and numerology. So these are all the core elements of this cult, and many times, they're expressed or espoused by different key figures in history at different times, and they don't appear to be part of a unified belief system, but if you dig deeply enough, you find that they are. And so this is what you find, is that throughout history, you have always these personalities who are key in preserving or disseminating or expanding on these ideas. And they are typically associated one way or the other with some kind of belief system or cult or society, which had a fundamental influence in the direction of Western civilization. So, there's a lot of topics to explain there, but the modern idea of Western civilization is really sort of a whitewash, a distortion of the true history. This is what I talk about in my book, The Dying God. And this is why when you look at it more accurately, it's an attempt to present the history, the progress and evolution of occultism as being the basis of Western history, because to an extent it is. The American and French revolutions were the first victories of these societies. The first implement. This is why they created the separation of church and state, because it was the beginning of these are societies and beliefs that had been underground for centuries, particularly in the West. In the West, they had been often brutally suppressed by the Catholic Church. So they had to find many ways to survive over the years, and eventually, in the 18th century, with the founding of organizations like the Illuminati and the Freemasons in particular, they were able to gain enough political power that they were actually able to finally overthrow the church and create their first two political systems that gave them some degree of political power. So that's been, of course, expanding significantly in our time, and we see its progression, but of course, it's never mentioned as such, right? And the point really is to present history as the evolution of secularism, which is why they begin in Greece. And the Greeks were supposedly the first ones to reject the idea of gods and to begin this process of reason, because in their minds, the use of reason leads you ultimately to the rejection of the idea of God. And this, in the end, goes back to an occult idea, which is the idea that man is God. So to simplify, this is why they create this version of history as, again, beginning in Greece, evolving through Rome, and then the Renaissance. Again, the Renaissance is supposed to be like, this flourishing of humanism, which again gives a strong kickstart to the development of secularism, which evolves into Enlightenment, which again takes us to the French and American revolutions. So again, if you look at the history of the Renaissance, it was actually fully an occult movement, and it was largely a movement that was founded on the discovery of Hermeticism in particular, Jewish Kabbalism as well, and sponsored in particular by the Medici family, who was the most powerful family in Italy at the time. Excuse noise. So it's also a movement that really brought forward a lot of the occult influences in Europe, and allowed these underground societies to again gain quite a bit of momentum, to the point where they're able to create one of the most important occult orders in modern times, which is the Rosicrucians. And that's really where the history of occultism really takes hold in Europe. And it's from there that you get the Freemasons and other organizations, and really how you can follow the development and transformation of Western society so that it's become what it has. So the story of Harut-Marut. So this is really fascinating. So it's amazing. So when you look at the study of the origins of occultism, a lot of Western academics are struggling with it, because, well, as I mentioned, there's all these elements that contributed to it, and they come from different traditions. Right? So Neoplatonism comes from Greece, Hermeticism comes from Egypt. The ancient mysteries are practiced in different parts, like in Syria, in Egypt, in the Roman Empire. There's also the Persian influence. So the Persian Empire at the time was a massive empire that had a substantial influence, and it followed a religion called Zoroastrianism, which also appears to have contributed to elements. So when the scholars look at all these traditions and how they all sort of influenced each other, they struggle to try to explain which one was the origin, right? So if you look at, like in Judaism in particular, if you look at the history of Kabbalah, Most scholars agree that it is a late development, right? So it's important to remember that according to Kabbalah, this is ancient wisdom that goes all the way back to the fallen angels or beyond, right? Time of the flood or to Moses. But most scholars accept that that's an invention that it had to have emerged much later. But then when they look at the elements, some of them suggest, oh, it's from Persian influence, and others say, no, it's Greek influence. And so it's the Quran that, for me, provided the single clue that answered all these questions that allowed me basically to write my 6 volumes to explain exactly where what was the trajectory of these ideas. So basically, to go back to the history of Judaism, we have to understand that there's another verse in the Quran which is important, right? It talks about the 2 times that the Jews were punished and taken into captivity, right? So this refers to the 6th century BC when they were conquered by the Babylonians, and the second time when they were conquered for the last time in 70 AD by the Romans. And it says ever since then that the Jews have been living in a diaspora, right? And why they hope for a return to the land of Zion. So the whole story of the Bible, basically, with very simple terms, you have Abraham, who was the friend of God, obviously, who sort of, reforms the religion of Judaism. His followers end up in Egypt. They are rescued by Moses. They're taken back to the land promised to Abraham, which is the land of Israel. And then when the Jews arrive there, they're warned to not worship the gods of the people they're going to conquer, or to practice their beliefs, or to intermarry with them. So now if you look at this very important period there's various estimates of when the Exodus would have taken place, maybe let's say around 1200 BC, all the way up until 600 BC. This entire period of the Bible story is a story about the Jews continually rejecting the worship of Allah and turning to the worship of the gods of the people that they had conquered, the gods of the people of Canaan, as they're known. And so many prophets are sent to the Jews to try to reform them. It gets so bad that so in Solomon's temple itself, it becomes a center of pagan worship. So basically, the center would be like the Vatican becoming, an openly pagan temple. And so you get numerous prophets that are sent over and over to try to reform them. And in the Bible, it shows that God warns them over and over that if they don't stop these pagan practices, that they will be taken into captivity. So that's exactly the prophecy that's fulfilled in the year, I think it's 597 BC, when the Assyrians come and capture the kingdom of, it's the kingdom of Judah at this point, because there's 2 kingdoms that split. So there's the kingdom of Israel, which was first conquered by the Assyrians, and they were dispersed, and that's the 10 tribe of Israel, who then become known as the lost tribes of Israel. Then you have the remaining 2 tribes, which is Judah and Benjamin, that remain in the kingdom of Judah. They're conquered in 597, and they're taken to Babylon into captivity. So again, this is prophecy fulfilled. So what's key here is that the Quran talks about, so first of all, the Surah Al-Baqarah, which is interesting, is the first chapter of the Quran. The first almost 100 verses are focused on criticizing the Jews, right? Criticizing them for being disobedient, for rejecting the covenant, for worshiping the calf, for basically all the disobedience that were described until this point. And so what's difficult here is that we have to remember that this, Allah is the one who's allowed to criticize the Jews, right? So despite the fact that we have all these criticism of their practices, according to Sharia, Muslims are still required to treat them as people of the book, right? So if you have an Islamic state, the Jewish people are a respected component of, a community within the Islamic state, and Muslims are required to protect them. It's very much the same case with the Christians, that because even though the Christians worship Jesus as the Son of God, as part of a Trinity, and so on and so forth, effectively introduced pagan elements into their cult, we're still required to respect them as believers. And so the Jews, to a degree, we may disagree with many of the elements of their practices and their beliefs, but they are still a people of the book. They are still part of this this tradition of God's revelation. So it's important to, this is an important distinction, how we have to remember how we're supposed to look and respect the Jews. It's that we don't have to agree with them, but we still, again, have to respect them as people of the book. But now when you get to verse 102, we have a different kind of criticism. So this criticism now is not addressed at the Jewish people as a whole, but it says a segment of the Jews who turned their back on the religion. And they're the ones who learned magic from the Satans. I'm not sure how to translate that in English, who learned it from Harut and Marut in Babylon. So again, this is an important period in Jewish history because the entire remaining population of the Jewish people, I think the estimate is about 50,000 of them, and the population of Babylon was about 250,000 people at the time. So the Jewish population would have represented almost 20% of the population of that city, which would have been the New York of its time, the most important city in the world, the cultural center of the world. And so the part where it gets tricky, and I hope this doesn't get too complicated, brothers, but basically, when scholars look at the history of particularly like the cult of astrology, it's been identified as emerging again in the 6th century BC. And this again was the time when the Jews, as I say, represented 20% of the population. So they were a substantial group. In fact, the prophet Daniel himself is said to have been, among the members of the wise men of Babylon. So, because the Babylonians used to worship, basically they practice a kind of omen, a divination from omens. So if a bird fell from the sky, or if a meteor appeared or a shooting star, they used to read the future or read omens from these phenomena. There's a great book about the whole history called From the Omens of Babylon, which talks about this whole early history of Babylon omen magic and how it developed into astrology. Because what's unique now is that astrology, because of these practices, the Babylonians had a highly advanced study of the stars and planets. And but the problem was that they weren't able to predict the course of the planets because of their calendar system. And this new calendar system, which was developed in the 6th century BC, allowed them to do so. And it's only then that you get the development of the study of astrology. So again, if you read any academic studies on the history of astronomy, which is fascinating, or history, which is astronomy and astrology are basically, in those times, they weren't considered to be two different topics. But scholars have basically identified that, yes, 6th century BC, and it can be proven definitively that it was developed in that century. So what's interesting then is because astrology eventually becomes a core aspect of this Western esoteric tradition, and most particularly of a Jewish mystical tradition, eventually known as Kabbalah. So the trick is that so the Jews are held captive in Babylon for about 50 years. In the 538 BC, the Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire. This is when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon. So the important event that happens here is that the Jews are released from captivity, and they're allowed to return to Palestine, where they begin to rebuild the Second Temple. And so another important influence happens here, and this is the influence of Persian religion. because the Persians in particular followed the religion of Zoroastrianism, which was revealed through a prophet known as Zoroaster, and he taught the existence of two competing gods, so a good and evil god. So there's Ahura Mazda, who is the good god, who competes against Ahriman, who is the evil god. And so the priests of this religion are known as magi, and that's who we get the word magic from. So the problem is that when academics look at when they look at Zoroastrianism and they look at the Jewish Kabbalah, there's some elements of similarity, but not enough to point to a clear influence. And this is where they get confused. So now, Franz Kumo, I mention him very often because I consider him, my humble opinion, as probably the greatest scholar of the 20th century. You know, the thing is, when you get to academics in the study of ancient history, they tend to focus on a particular part of ancient civilization. So they'll focus on Greek, or they'll focus on Middle Eastern or Egyptian. And it's very, very rare to have a knowledge of basically all of those cultures. So he was a rare case, because that's the problem, is that this separating of these cultures the way we do today is a modern prejudice, and it was not reflected in ancient times. Greece is what I argue was fundamentally a Middle Eastern civilization. There was very little difference between the cult and the practices and belief systems of the Greeks and those of the peoples of the Middle East. In fact, what's interesting is that a lot of the ancient sources openly claim that the Greeks gained their religion from the Middle East, in particular the Magi. So what Franz Kumo pointed out, and it's because of his knowledge of his broad knowledge of all these topics, he's delving into areas that most other scholars have never heard about. And what he identified is that within the Zoroastrian religion, there was a subcult who were heretics. Okay, so this is a cult they refer to them as Deva worshippers, because the Zoroastrians used to have belief in demons, or jinn as we call them, and they referred to them as devas. So this cult, this subcult, this heretical Zoroastrian cult, they basically were devil worshippers who worshiped the devil, or the planet Saturn, as a god named Zurvan, which means like a boundless time or something like that. And they worshipped the devas, and they worshipped Ahriman as well, who is supposed to be the evil god. So this was again a subcult that was treated as heretics and marginalized and rejected by sort of the Orthodox Zoroastrian community. And this is now where we get the explanation of the Harut and Marut story. So I won't go into the legends and the various accounts of who Harut and Marut are, because as you know, there's many of them, and it's very difficult to identify what was going on. The important point here is that magic was supposedly learned from the Satans in Babylon, which pinpoints it to this century when you can see all these elements are starting to come together. So what Franz Kumo identified was that this emerging belief system now was a mixture of ancient Babylonian magic, plus this new astrology, plus these elements of this heretical Zoroastrianism. So what's important here is that what I tried to identify and prove in my books is that this cult now is the beginnings of the Jewish Kabbalah. That all those are all the key elements that begin to form it. So and it's the cult of magic. So as the cult of magic survives through the Western esoteric tradition and can be traced to Babylon, as the Quran identifies, it can all be traced to these various elements of beliefs that formed in Babylon, and as I mentioned, they include astrology, numerology.
Sorry, David.
Yes.
Just for the viewers' benefit as well, just to keep the timeline to perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So is it, so the Quran talks about Harut and Marut and talks about, they were actually angels and they obviously introduced the magic at the time of the Solomon, right?
They claim.
Or so is it, because the way I'm reading the translation right now, it says, Mulk Solomon. So that means the kingdom of Solomon. Is it at the time of Solomon or it was prior to Solomon?
No. So this is why this is really important, because you're talking about the founding legend of Freemasonry, right? The entire point. So the reason why Freemasons call themselves Masons is because they are builders, right? They are building the bricks, laying the foundation for the rebuilding of the third temple.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So the first temple was destroyed with the Babylonian conquest. When they were released, they began the second temple. The second temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, and now they want to build the third temple, which is why as well the Templars were named after the temple, because of the entire mythology of rebuilding the third temple is the very basis of the Masonic belief system and the entire agenda that we're witnessing today, right?
Right.
So, but they attributed, and this is where the Quran is clear, falsely attributed it to Suleiman.
Right.
And so, because Solomon obviously did not teach magic.
Right.
The magic was taught by the shayateen. This is what the verse says. And this is what's very clear. So this is why the Solomon would have existed a few hundred years before the Babylonian captivity. And so the story is, so we have to remember too that the reason why Solomon is considered important here and why his skill or craft is essential to this legend is because, of course, as we know, Suleiman was given control over the jinn.
Right.
And so this is why Suleiman apparently possessed a seal, which was a 6-pointed star and a ring, which gave him control over the jinn. And this is the fundamental belief. And this is why, the sigil of the 6-pointed star is core to the entire magical tradition. It's called the Key of Solomon, because control of jinn is basically the basis of magic.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And so the story is apparently that Suleiman, the jinn left a book under his throne or seat, and after he died, it was later discovered, and that's how this book of magic was falsely attributed to Suleiman. So this is what we know, fortunately, from the mercy of Allah to reveal these truths to us, and unfortunately, the opposite is what these secret societies have been holding to for centuries now.
Okay, so just to clarify as well, so that means the Harut and Marut, their exact timeline, it's not definitive. Like it's definitely way before even Moses, right?
I don't know. I don't think so. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Those are level of details that are difficult. Another point that I discovered. So I co-wrote another book with brother Mustaqim Blair, and he recently made a translation of a New English translation of the Quran, and I asked him about the word Satans, right? The shayateen, it says, were the ones who taught magic and falsely attributed to Suleiman.
Right.
And unfortunately, I don't read Arabic, so I haven't been able to find anything in any literature to explain what the shayateen mean. There's one hadith in Bukhari that talks about the shaitan. I can't remember the details of it, but it's only one. And I asked him, is it possible that shayateen means Satanists?
Mm-hmm.
And it is possible. So they might have been learning magic from Satanists. Because there's another very important point here that this verse is very clear about, and it says that the purchasers of magic know that they have no part in the hereafter.
They have essentially sold their soul to the devil.
Essentially sold their soul.
As the saying goes, yeah.
As the saying goes, which is, of course, is a commonly repeated theme throughout, right? I mean, the most modern version of that story is Faust, written by Goethe, who was a member of the Illuminati. Right? So it's a common theme that has been popular for a very long time. So it's very difficult to understand, but we need to be mindful of it because it helps us to understand how they can operate at the level that they do, right? How can they carry out plans and plans that are so openly diabolical, right? Which for most other people are basically unthinkable if they know that it leads to hellfire. So they're conscious of their decision, is what it seems. So we have to remember what's important here is that we're talking about learning magic from Satanists in Babylon in the 6th century BC by a group of Jews. This is not the entire community. This is a segment now that it's been isolated to, a segment who return their back on the religion. This is what the verse says, right? So who apostatize consciously. So they might continue to profess some kind of Judaism or identify with the Jewish as a people, but when it comes to their religion, they have rejected God and chosen Satan as their God, and done so knowingly, and have chosen to learn magic to help to what they think is help them work towards their objectives.
Understood.
So again, it's really fascinating that you can easily trace now everything that happened. So the key, as I said, is to look at the proposition of Franz Cumont, who identified this cult now of the Magi. The Babylon Magi are not Zoroastrians; they are heretics who practice this combination of Babylonian magic. So what's key here is that there's a number of books that are attributed to Zoroaster. And this is common in these times because there's many books that are falsely attributed to various prophets, right? There's the book of Enoch, there's a book of Abraham, and all the various books. This has confused a lot of people because they don't realize that this is just a practice of falsely making false attribution. And so these books are books about magic and have no relation at all whatsoever with Zoroastrianism. And so Franz Cumont argues that this is, these are the books that are representative of this early cult. And so what happens is that when the Jews are released from captivity in 538 BC, a lot of them go to Palestine, as I mentioned, to help rebuild the temple, but a lot of them, they go to different parts of the world as well. They go to Egypt and they go to Greece. And so my argument is that these so-called Magi were actually Jewish Kabbalists, because we're talking about a time when the world was not aware of who the Jews were, right? Herodotus writes about the Jews. So he wrote his histories, I think around 450 BC, but he didn't know of a Jewish religion. He talked about a people who had escaped colony from Egypt who had settled in Palestine who practiced circumcision. What's also fascinating is he describes them as black and woolly haired. But
yeah, and it's interesting. Like when I've taken back in the day when I took philosophy courses in university, and when we were studying Plato and Aristotle, there's no mention of a community called Jews or the Jewish people.
Right.
So it's interesting, even though they existed, right? Because Allah has been sending down prophets from time immemorial. So it's very interesting, very interesting.
Exactly. So I argue that Plato would have been the first exponent of this magical tradition in Greece. And so, I do substantiate this in my books, in my research, because so basically the core belief of these ancient Magi has always been, as I said, astrology, numerology, and all these various elements, but the core practice was always some kind of mystery rite, right? And so the Magi used to worship a Persian god called Mithras, who is a Persian version of the dying god. And this dying god, there's many versions of him throughout the Middle East. So in Egypt, he's Osiris. In Babylon, he's Bel or Marduk. And in Greece, he's Apollo or he's Dionysus. And so what you find is that the cult of Dionysus becomes, in fact, when you look at the Greek history, Greek civilization, according to their own accounts, was founded by Phoenicians, right? So when we have the alphabet today, this is why the alphabet that formed from the first three letters of Greek is actually a Phoenician or Semitic alphabet, right? Which is why it's related to Aleph, Bet, Tet, right? Which is related to the Hebrew alphabet. And so the early history basically was entirely Phoenician. And I mentioned several books in mine by two scholars in particular. There's a number of them, but there's Walter Burkert and M.L. West. And these guys are like the leading academics, leading experts in sort of that period of Greek history. And they have one book is a gigantic book. It's like 600 or 700 pages devoted specifically to the influence of Phoenician, but basically Middle Eastern culture on the virgin Greek civilization. So it's fundamentally a Middle Eastern civilization. And so what happens is that, after the Babylonian period, you get this transference of the cult of Dionysus gets transplanted into Greece. And so this Dionysian cult is really, really key because it sort of transplants the earlier Greek religion, and it becomes the basis of an occult tradition known as Orphism. And Orphism, in terms of the Western occult tradition, is basically one of the key core, origin elements. And so when you look at the literature, you look at Heraclitus himself, and Heraclitus again as well wrote in, I believe, as early as the 500s, and he says openly that the cult of Dionysus was learned from the Magi, and that it is an infernal cult dedicated to the phallus, right? Because all these ancient cults typically use the phallus as their main symbol. They're academics like to refer to them as fertility cults, but they're basically they're satanic cults that are focused around the worship of the phallus. So there's another find that was found at Derveni. I think it's in Greece, and it's dated all as well from the 3rd century BC, and it as well. So even if Heraclitus, we can't prove that what he said was definitely written in the 6th or 5th century BC. There is a find dated to the 3rd century BC or 4th century BC that clearly repeats exactly what he said, that the cult of Dionysus was derived from the Magi, the Persian Magi. So again, there's no relation between that cult and Zoroastrianism, which is what has thrown so many scholars off, because you have to understand how Franz Cumont identified it, that it's not Zoroastrianism, it's heretical, satanic as Zoroastrianism, and that's how. So basically what happens is that the first important exponent as I mentioned, you have the cult of Dionysus, then you have Orphism. The first exponent and most important exponent of Orphism is Pythagoras. And from Pythagoras, then you have Plato. And when you look at most of Plato's literature, this is why Plato is regarded, even in the history. That's why in the Renaissance, they looked at Plato as being the godfather of Kabbalistic history, right? These are the leading Jewish Kabbalists of the time look at Plato. There's another Jewish scholar from 300s BC. His name is Aristobulus, and he says himself as well. So he would have been only maybe decades away from the time of Plato. He as well says that Plato studied Jewish books. And then there's various legends that Pythagoras himself and a lot of the early Greek philosophers traveled to Babylon and Egypt to study the sciences in those parts of the world. So this is why this is a really important component of my book of the Dying Goddess, to try to effectively demonstrate that Greek philosophy was the earliest manifestation of Jewish Kabbalah. And this is why Greek philosophy from that point on, first of all, this is why it's treated in modern histories as the birth of Western philosophy. And this is why it's out of that you get Platonism and Neoplatonism, which again is the core of the occult tradition. In short.
So this is very interesting because I was having a conversation with someone, and he defined, and I agree with him, like he defined philosophy as something. It's there because they invented the Western in the Western world, they invented philosophy because they were just confused. So and so it looks like the originators of all this, like the Magi, whatever, they're here is sound confusion, and then they came up with quote unquote Greek philosophy to kind of as a front, probably, I don't know, to see they can figure out things on their own using quote unquote philosophy. But that's interesting. And like today, like we can see, like for people who are who like to be God conscious, and they look at secular society, which is a godless society. Like they can say, okay, on the merits of secularism, that it's a faulty, but they don't tie it to that. It seems, based on your research, there has been from time immemorial, like there have been movements to take society and make it secular eventually. So
yeah, exactly. And this is why I say, this is how I begin my book by explaining that the only way to understand this is as a cosmic conspiracy, right? And this is like, even Muslims, we tend to underestimate how things are taking place. And that's why I think research is important to understand, right? People think that it's almost like the Christian interpretation of the devil's running around from person to person, whispering, trying to mislead them, instead of considering the possibility that there is a singular plot, right? And I shy away from saying something like that because it's significant, right? But at the same time, I'm not willing to say categorically that I think that's what's happening, but the evidence seems to point to something like that. What I've even found is, like, you can go back all into ancient times, and this is why the worship of the dying god. What's interesting is that the dying god typically is what's called a usurper god. So if you look at most of the stories, like Zeus overthrew the original creator god, right? And it's why you find in most of the cults of the ancient Middle East, these gods are gods who overthrew the creator god with the assistance of the titans, the giants, or the fallen angels, and then becomes worshipped as the one true God. So it seems, it appears to me, and I'm certainly not going to claim that I'm any kind of authority on this subject, right? But it's just from what I've studied, and the evidence seems to support. I think it's a claim that would require a lot more, a closer study to confirm, but that seems to be the case. So even in ancient times, it seems that this is how the devil convinced the world to worship him as the true God, because this dying God becomes the basis of the Western occult tradition. And maybe in a lot of ways the average person had no idea, because what's also interesting is that this dying God was always worshipped as a god of the underworld. And so the term that academics use is they call them chthonic gods. Chthonic means typically that they're associated with the underworld, but it also means that they're associated with evil. So these were gods in many cases who were consciously worshipped as evil gods in ancient times. And so what's curious is that this is why I think it's interesting that the verse of Harut and Marut talks about the Satanists teaching magic, because even though this heretical magic cult that developed in the 6th century BC is a merger of the ancient dying god cult, right, that had been practiced widely throughout the Middle East for at least 1,000 years before then. So basically, it's the satanic cult that then added into it elements of Babylonian magic to create the beginnings of the Kabbalah. And so from that point forward, the trajectory is clear, is that you can trace the true shape of Western civilization by following who was adhering to this belief system. Who were spearheading it, and it's clear. So it begins with Plato, right? And again, so after him, it becomes known as Neoplatonism, and there's several philosophers who are responsible for perpetuating that tradition. And there's a whole bloodline that I identify in some of my early chapters that I call the Mithraic bloodline, because when you look at the families that were responsible for the cult of Mithras, and the cult of Mithras, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but this is the cult which is, so as you know, there's many pagan elements that clearly infiltrated Christianity, right? So the Eucharist, the idea of Jesus being born on December 25th, which is the winter solstice, being resurrected on Easter, being the Son of God, all these concepts are very clearly and have been identified for centuries with the cult of Mithras. What's curious about the cult of Mithras is that it was perpetuated by a group of 4 families. So the one family is the house of Herod. So these were the Edomite rulers of the Jewish community at the time of Jesus. The famous story is that when the Magi came to see Herod and told him that they had seen the star of the Messiah, that's when he ordered the slaughter of the innocents, right? To try, and this is why Jesus escaped with his parents to Egypt to try to escape the slaughter. So this house of Herod now, they intermarry with this particular branch of the Roman Empire, the descendants of Caesar, from Augustus to Caligula, I think, and another family from Syria known as the priest kings of Emesa. So I think the city's called Homs today in Syria. It's a traditional locale of the cult of the worship of very interestingly, a black stone identified with a god named Elagabalus. Elagabalus is basically Balus, it's their version of the dying god. And the royal family of a place called Commagene, which is a portion of southeastern Turkey, which is very much it's the birthplace of this Mithraic cult. And they're important because they claim dual descent from Alexander the Great and the Persian Empire. And so Alexander is a very sort of important component in all of this. Basically worshipped as the manifestation of the sun god in some ways. So these 4 families now become the ones responsible for the development and spread of the cult of Mithras. And what happens is that their descendants become the rulers of the Roman Empire, and through several important episodes, they try to make the worship of Mithras or Sol Invictus as the official god of the Roman Empire. They don't succeed, but finally it's Constantine who establishes his version of the Catholic Church with the Council of Nicaea in 333 BC, which effectively is an adaptation of the worship of Mithras to Christianity. And this is why the true reform movement of Jesus gets marginalized, and this now pagan version of Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So
sorry. Yeah, so it's not a big correction. It was 325 AD that the Council of Nicaea.
Was it? Okay.
And yes, you're right. So basically, they December 25 comes from the birthday of the Roman sun god, and they stamped it for Auzubillah, Prophet Jesus' birthday, right? And that's where the whole Trinitarian, they made him divine, right? So
exactly.
Yeah.
They basically disguised Mithras. So effectively, they were able to preserve their satanic cult, but disguise it as Christian. I have no idea to what extent. That's what's curious, right? Is that despite these facts, we're expected to respect the Christians as people of the book. This is the mercy of Allah, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because those are really crazy times, because there's actually a really good book called Jesus, a Prophet of Islam. But it should be renamed The History of Unitarian Christianity, because it talks about how the true teach the immediate followers of Jesus and the true teaching of Jesus got all like diluted with the ideologies and mythologies of the Romans, and then it came to a culmination at with the Council of Nicaea.
Mhm.
And after the Council of Nicaea, Christians who believed in one God, who were the true believers of Jesus, were massacred.
They're marginalized.
Like,
Yes,
we consider kind of like a genocide that took place
Mhm.
against the Unitarian Christians at that time. So it's it's very interesting.
exactly.
Yeah.
So what's important as well is that, as you say, so the followers of Jesus, the real followers of Jesus, were known as the early church, and they were led by James, and of course they came into conflict with Paul, and Paul, who was not an original disciple, claimed to have had a vision. And so there's Robert Eisenman, who's one of the leading experts on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He's written an amazing article called Paul and the Herodians, who claims that Paul was actually an agent of the house of Herod. And this is interesting because now it links him to this entire birth of the Mithraic cult. And there's many other books that show that Paul was basically a Kabbalist. And this is why Paul, introduced a mystical Kabbalistic interpretation of Christianity, which is why it's so complicated. And it's his version of Christianity that eventually won over from the early Christians, despite the fact that he was in conflict with them, despite the fact that they rejected him as well too. So from there, basically, so that was a really important period for the birth of, of the establishment of this occult tradition, particularly Neoplatonism, because that's the cult. So the Neoplatonism was basically carried forward by the survival of the Platonic Academy, right, which existed in Rome and was finally banned when the Roman Empire became Christian. What's curious is that there's various reports that a number of survivors from the Platonic Academy ended up in Haran in Turkey. And we've talked about Haran before. Haran basically is the seat, the equivalent seat of where, the occult tradition, is reborn for that period of time in the Islamic Empire. So from Haran, you get the Sabians. From the Sabians, you get the Brethren of Sincerity. You also get, elements of Sufism, and basically the survival of that occult history in the Islamic world. And that is the so-called Eastern mystics that the Masons claim the Templars came into contact with, right? So, so that's the next point in history, and this is where we're probably going to be out of time, but that's really the next important aspect of this story, is when the Templars, again, another satanic order disguised as Christian, who embarked on this so-called crusade. Well, they didn't participate in the crusade, but they took advantage of the success of the crusade to establish an order, again, named after the Temple of Solomon, and becomes really the greatest legend of modern occultism, because the entire basis of that occult belief system is really founded on the Templars and what they supposedly accomplished there, or what their ultimate purpose was, and of course their worship of Baphomet, which was some kind of satanic symbol that they worshipped.
Would it be safe to say also that the occult influences, or the minority of Jews that were doing this black magic kind of spread it now, in today's time, has also affected even mainstream Judaism, because it seems that their belief, they don't really have a belief in an afterlife. Like a lot, it doesn't, or it's not like it's just kind of very obscure. If you ask even mainstream Jews in their belief, compared to obviously the Jews who were following Allah in an orthodox fashion would talk about, our goal is a high station in the afterlife. Would it be safe to say that that's happening?
Yeah. So basically, what's the the whole story, modern story, is pretty easy to trace, because what you can see is that, as I mentioned earlier, the important group was the Rosicrucians, right? And there's other groups before this that are really important. They're all focused on the veneration of the Templars, effectively, like the Order of the Golden Fleece, the Order of the Garter. There's a survival of the Templars, this is like the Templars are treated as if they had been disbanded in 1312, but they actually survived in Portugal as the Order of Christ. And this is what I trace in several chapters in my book, to see how all these families survived. And what's most important about all of them is that they claim the hereditary title of King of Jerusalem. Right? This is important because the Messiah is expected to come from the line of David, and so these are all families. So because basically, after, when the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem, that's what they did. They established a kingdom of Jerusalem, and it lasted for a couple hundred years until the Muslims reconquered it. But they continued to retain the title. So even up until today, you have Otto von Habsburg, who died only a few years ago, Grand Master of the Order of the Golden Fleece, one of the most influential, political schemers of modern times. He also claimed the title of Kingdom of Jerusalem. And this is a title that you find throughout. So basically, what seems to be is that these families, and why they're involved in these orders, and why they are also typically at the forefront of perpetuating this occult tradition, is because they're preserving what they believe is the lineage of the Messiah. Because that ultimately is the goal, right? The goal is to, when the Messiah arrives, he will rebuild the third temple. And this is what they tried to get Trump basically involved in as well, too, right? So, so you have all these orders, and you have these families continually working behind the scenes for exactly that, perpetuating this belief, trying to gain political power. And the Rosicrucians, again, were the first important manifestation. So the Rosicrucians were responsible for the mission of Shabbatai Zevi. And Shabbatai Zevi was a false Jewish Messiah who declared himself Messiah in 1666. This is an enormous event in Jewish history, because by modern estimates, he misled approximately half of the world's Jewish population. So, talking about a Jewish population that was spread, all kinds of parts of the world, in North Africa, in Yemen, in Syria, in Greece, in Italy, Europe. So this message managed to get out, and again, half the Jewish world was fooled until he converted to Islam, and that became now a kind of mystery, where his believers believed that he was going like in some kind of mystic cycle, where his conversion was part of a mystical process, and they didn't believe that he actually apostatized. So why it's important is because Kabbalah had for a long time been a very marginal practice, or set of topics, but it's with Isaac Luria in the 1500s that it's what's called a new Kabbalah, and it gains a new level of legitimacy. And so the mission of Shabbatai Zevi was based on the Kabbalah of Isaac Luria, and he's the one who basically gave a platform for it, and this is where it begins its rise. And so for a long time, and this is what's exposed by Rabbi Entelman, and I highly recommend his two books, to eliminate the opiate, because he's the only historian that I've seen treat these topics. Because what he showed is that that the Sabbatians, the followers of Shabbatai Zevi, the Sabbatians, they continued to be marginalized and treated as heretics. And then you get the revival of the movement in the 1800s by Jacob Frank, who declared to be a reincarnation of Zevi. And again, this is a movement so what people forget is that Judaism, of course, is a religion, and it's possible, like any other religion, to be excommunicated from it, right? And so this time, to be Jewish meant that you followed the Jewish religion. And this is the religion that's criticized in the first portion of Surat al-Baqarah, right? That we may not agree with it, but this is the legitimate Jewish religion. So they were in constant conflict with the Sabbatians, and they fought with them. They tried to excommunicate them. But the Sabbatians slowly started to gain increasing influence, until the point that they founded two movements within Judaism. There's the Reform movement, and the conservative movement of Judaism. And what's happened is that, I quote in my book of a Jewish a rabbi who explains that, until that time, there had only been Judaism. And he said that it's the enemies of Judaism who invented these labels so they could try to basically give themselves some kind of legitimacy that they were just a different interpretation of Judaism. And this is what happened. So basically, since then, you've had the growing marginalization of Orthodox Judaism and the growing power of the Reform and conservative movement. In the United States in particular, the Reform movement is huge. And I'll just touch on it, but I have a lot that I touch on. It's very curious because they're basically the synagogues that were involved in the Sabbatean movement. They're the ones that worked for the readmittance of Jews into England. And they founded what's called the Bevis Mark Synagogue in London, which is the first synagogue in London. And so this synagogue now had sisters. So it's out of this synagogue and its relationship that you get the founding of the Royal Society. And out of the founding of the Royal Society, you get the Freemasons. And this synagogue has sister synagogues in the United States. There's Bevis, there's, I'll just name where they're basically in Philadelphia, in New York, in Charleston, and Portland, in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island. So, so these synagogues basically become key actors closely involved in the American Revolution, particularly one man who was an agent of the Rothschilds. His name is Haim Solomon, who was a member of the Mikveh Israel congregation in Philadelphia, which is really a synagogue that was really central to the revolution. And then basically most of their efforts after the revolution is focused in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where you get the birth of Scottish Rite Freemasonry by 7 founding Jewish members, who are all members of these families who were involved in all these synagogues. And so that is the Beth Elohim Synagogue in Charleston, and it's from that synagogue, the same one which is responsible for the founding of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which becomes the birthplace of the Reformed Jewish movement in the United States. And so it's basically out of that movement that you eventually get the Zionist movement. So all to say that basically this is how this Sabbatean influence has invaded Judaism, and to a large extent taking it over. And this is effectively why you see this sort of secularization of Judaism, because where Jews used to live in separate communities called ghettos, where they practice, the unique elements of their religion, it is with the Sabbateans, particularly Moses Mendelssohn, who's considered the father of secular Judaism. In the 1800s, he began to promote the assimilation of Jews, and he was recorded as being one of the successors of Shabbatai Zevi. So he basically taught a kind of Judaism, which was a throwing off of Jewish religion and culture, and promoting the full assimilation, as a solution, as popularly known as the Jewish problem. And so that really begins this process of where you have Jews identifying as being ethnically Jewish, but not identifying or practicing the elements of the Jewish religion. And that effectively is really how you get the makeup of the modern Jewish community.
Jazakallah for that. Yeah, I could see that the dilution is pretty much complete. It seems
Exactly.
like it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Jazakallah for that. Thanks for sharing that. I believe our audience, they have kind of learned a lot in this session, and they'll obviously will have more questions, and we can always share it online. Any questions from you, Ali, at this point?
Well, Jazakallah khair for this. I think it was very informative, and it was fascinating information that you shared with us and the audience. And I think Muslims haven't really been looking into these matters, this much depth. And I think there's definitely a need to understand the order of this very world we live in. Mm-hmm. And then definitely more needs to be done. And what we'll also do is we will also share with the viewers the link to buy your books, especially The Dying God, and also your other work, and also a link to your website. So if somebody has, I mean, it was definitely a lot of information condensed in less than an hour, and that's why even I was like getting confused with the timelines, because a lot of us actually, the normative Muslims don't really have the historical contextual understanding of the Western philosophy and the Western civilization itself, and forget about delving deeper into these topics. And I think that's why the educational component, I believe, is critical for us Muslims to really start looking into the matters with an open mind, and really learning these things to better understand where we were, where we are, and where we're heading.
Exactly. And I hope that the lesson that Muslims see is that, again, these are not fringe topics. Everything that we talked about is an expansion of a single verse in the Quran.
Exactly.
It really shows the mercy of Allah. It just shows the depth and richness that we've been blessed with. The potential knowledge that we can derive when we look closely at some of the information that's been revealed to us, and the size of the answers that are made available to us, the significance of them.
No, absolutely. And then especially in this troubling times, I think it's also mercy of Allah that He kept everything. He just essentially touched the tip of the iceberg, so to call it, right?
Exactly.
Because the message is for the masses, right? And not everybody has, but at the same time, Allah does mention in the Quran as well, with the people who contemplate and ponder, who have a knowledge and better understanding, they know the true meaning of these verses, right? So it's basically an indication for people, for, let's say, not necessarily normative Muslim, but a little bit above average, scholarly people, to really pay attention to these verses and, go into depth and really try to understand them, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's definitely important. And again, thank you so much, David. It's always a pleasure, chatting with you, getting new information from you, which is impossible to find nowadays, right? And especially for the Muslims.
Exactly.
So, and again, Jazakallah khair for that. Again, what's your before we go? Is there anything new you're working on right now, or?
No, that's it.
But you know what? I think I think with all this information you've given, I think you mentioned that you haven't done much study on Hinduism related to all this, right? Yeah. So that would be an interesting arena to go into, because it's all interrelated, right? Because the whole rivalry between the gods also exists in Hinduism as well, right? So.
Yeah. There's a touch on a little bit, and anybody who's interested on my chapter on the Gog and Magog, because it's really interesting to see all the connections between the stories of the lost tribes and Alexander the Great, because Alexander, of course, conquered parts of Pakistan and India, right? And there's many communities there that trace descent from either lost tribes of Israel and or from Alexander, and how that sort of early Greek influence contributed to aspects of Hinduism and Buddhism.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So, anyways, Jazakallah khair for that, Brother David. Thank you all for listening. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.